look at it. Here we are, Lady and a Fox. Shall we continue? So, the next morning, he had more of a struggle than ever to wash and dress her. Indeed, at one time nothing but holding her by the scruff prevented her from getting away from him, but at last he achieved his object, and she was washed, brushed, scented, and dressed, although to be sure this left him better pleased than her, for she regarded her silk jacket with disfavour. Still, at breakfast, she was well mannered, though a trifle hasty with her food. Then his difficulties with her began, for she would go out. But as he has his housework to do, he could not allow it. He brought her picture books to divert her, but she would have none of them. Stayed at the door, scratching with her claws industriously, till she had worn away the paint. At first, he tried coaxing her and wheedling, gave her cards to play patience and so on. But, finding nothing would distract her from going out, his temper began to rise, and he told her plainly that she must wait his pleasure, and that he had as much natural obstinacy as she had. But, to all that, he said, she paid no heed whatever, but only scratched the harder. Thus, he let her continue until luncheon. And she would not sit up, or eat off a plate, but first was for getting on to the table, and when that was prevented, snatched her meat and ate it under the table. To all his rebukes, she turned a deaf or sullen ear, and so they each finished their meal eating little, either of them. For till she would sit at table, he would give her no more, and his vexation took away his own appetite. In the afternoon he took her out for her airing in the garden. She made no pretense now of enjoying the first snowdrops or the view from the terrace. No, there was only one thing for her now, the ducks, and she was off to them before he could stop her. Luckily, they were all swimming when she got there, for a stream running into the pond on the far side was not frozen there. When he had got down to the pond, she ran out onto the ice, which would not bear his weight, and though he called her and begged her to come back, she would not heed him, but stayed frisking about, getting as near the ducks as she dared, but being circumspect and venturing onto the thin ice. Presently, she turned on herself and began tearing off her clothes, and at last, by biting, got off her little jacket and taking it in her mouth, stuffed it into a hole in the ice where he could not get it. Then she ran hither and thither, a stark naked vixen, and without giving a glance to her poor husband, who stood silently now upon the bank, with despair and terror settled in his mind. She let him stay there most of the afternoon, till he was chilled through and through and worn out with watching her. At last, he reflected how she had just stripped herself, how in the morning she struggled against being dressed, and he thought perhaps he was too strict with her, and if he let her have her own way, they could manage to be happy, somehow together, even if she did eat off the floor. So he called out to her then, "Sylvia, come now. Be good. You shan't wear any of the clothes if you don't want to, and you needn't sit at the table neither, I promise. You shall do as you like in that, but You must give up one thing, and that is, you must stay with me and not go out alone, for that is dangerous. If any dog came on you, he would kill you." Directly he had finished speaking, she came to him joyously, began fawning on him and prancing round him, so that in spite of his vexation with her and being cold, he could not help stroking her. "Oh, Sylvia, are you not willful and cunning? I see you glory in being so, but I shall not reproach you, but shall stick to my side of the bargain. And you must stick to yours." He built a big fire, and he came back to the house and took a glass or two of spirits also to warm himself up, for he was chilled to the very bone. Then, after they had dined, to cheer himself he took another glass, and then another, and so on till he was very merry, he thought. And he would play with his vixen, she encouraging him with her pretty sportiveness. He got up to catch her, then finding himself unsteady on his legs, he went down on all fours. The long and the short of it is that by drinking he drowned all his sorrow, and then would be a beast too like his wife, though she was one through no fault of her own, and could not help it. To what lengths he went then in that drunken humour I shall not offend my readers by relating, but shall only say that he was so drunk and Scottish that he had a very imperfect recollection of what had passed when he woke the next morning. There is no exception to the rule that if a man drink heavily at night, the next morning will show the other side of his nature. Thus, with Mr. Tebrick, for as he had been beastly, merry, and a very daredevil the night before, so on his awakening was he ashamed, melancholic and a true penitent before his Creator. The first thing he did when he came to himself was to call out to God to forgive him for his sin. Then he fell into earnest prayer and continued so for half an hour upon his knees. Then he got up and dressed, but continued very melancholy for the whole of the morning. Being in this mood, you may imagine it hurt him to see his wife running about naked, but he reflected it would be a bad reformation that began with breaking faith. He had made a bargain, and he would stick to it, and so he let her be, though sorely against his will. For the same reason, that is, because he would stick to his side of the bargain, he did not require her to sit up at the table, but gave her breakfast on a dish in the corner, where, to tell the truth, she on her side ate it all up with great daintiness and propriety, nor did she make any attempt to go out of doors that morning, but lay curled up in an armchair before the fire, dozing. After lunch, he took her out, and she never so much as offered to go near the ducks, but running before him, led him on to take her a longer walk. This he consented to do very much, to her joy and delight, but by good luck, they walked above 4 miles across country and saw nobody. All the way, his wife kept running on ahead of him, then back to him to lick his hand and so on, and appeared delighted at taking exercise. And though they startled 2 or 3 rabbits and a hare in the course of their walk, she never attempted to go after them, only giving them a look and looking back to him, laughing at him, as it were for his warning cry of, "Puss, come in, no nonsense now." Just when they got home, man were going into the porch, they came face to face with an old woman. Mr. Tebrick stopped short in consternation and looked about for his vixen, but she had run forward without any shyness to greet her. Then he recognized the intruder. It was his wife's old nurse.
"What are you doing here, Mrs. Cork?"
he asked her. Mrs. Cork answered him in these words. "Poor thing, poor Miss Sylvia. It is a shame to let her run about like a dog. It is a shame, and your own wife too. But whatever she looks like, you should trust her the same as ever. If you do, she'll do her best to be a good wife to you. If you don't, I shouldn't wonder if she did turn into a proper fox. I saw her, sir, before I left, and I've had no peace of mind. I couldn't sleep thinking of her, so I've come back to look after her, as I have done all her life, sir." And she stooped down and took Mrs. Tebrick by the paw. Mr. Tebrick unlocked the door and they went in. When Mrs. Cork saw the house, she exclaimed again and again, "The place was a pigsty. They couldn't live like that. A gentleman must have somebody to look after him. She would do it. He could trust her with the secret." Had the old woman come the day before, it is likely enough that Mr. Tebrick would have sent her packing. But the voice of conscience, being woken in him by his drunkenness of the night before, he was heartily ashamed of his own management of the business. Moreover, the old woman's words that it was a shame to let her run about like a dog moved him exceedingly, being in this mood. The truth is, he welcomed her. But we may conclude that Mrs. Tebrick was as sorry to see her old nanny as her husband was glad. If we consider that she had been brought up strictly by her when she was a child, and was now again in her power, that her old nurse could never be satisfied by her now, whatever she did, but would always think her wicked to be a fox at all. There seems good reason for her dislike, and it is possible, too, that there may have been another cause as well, and that is jealousy. We know her husband was always trying to bring her back to be a woman, or at any rate, to get her to act like one. May she not have been hoping to get him to be like a beast himself, or act like one? May she not have thought it easier to change him, thus than ever to change herself back into being a woman? If we think that she had a success of this kind only the night before when he got drunk, can we not conclude that this was indeed the case? We have another good reason why the poor lady should hate to see her old nurse. It is certain that whatever hopes Mr. Tebrick had of Mrs. Cork affecting his wife for the better were disappointed. She grew steadily wider, and after a few days so intractable with her that Mr. Tebrick again took her under his complete control. The first morning, Mrs. Cork made her a new jacket, cutting down the sleeves of a blue silk one of Mrs. Tebrick's, trimming it with swan's down, and directly she'd altered it, put it on her mistress, and fetching a mirror would have it admire the fit of it. All the time, she waited on Mrs. Tebrick. The old woman talked to her as though she were a baby, treated her as such, never thinking perhaps that she was either the one thing or the other, that is either a lady to whom she owed respect, who had rational powers exceeding her own, or else a wild creature on whom words were wasted. But though at first she submitted passively, Mrs. Tebrick only waited for her nanny's back to be turned to tear up her pretty piece of handiwork into shreds, then ran gaily about, waving her brush with only a few ribands still hanging from her neck. So it was time after time, for the old woman was used to having her own way, until Mrs. Cork would, I think, have tried punishing her, if she had not been afraid of Mrs. Tebrick's rows of white teeth, which she often showed her, then laughing afterwards as if to say it was only play. Not content with tearing off the dresses that were fitted on her, one day Sylvia slipped upstairs to her wardrobe and tore down all her old dresses and made havoc with them, not sparing her wedding dress either, but tearing and ripping them all up so that there was hardly a shred or rag left big enough to dress a doll in. On this, Mr. Tebrick, who had let the old woman have most of her management to see what she could make of her, took her back under his own control. He was sorry enough now that Mrs. Cork had disappointed him in the hopes he had had of her, to have the old woman, as it were, on his hands. True, she could be useful enough in many ways to him by doing the housework, the cooking, and mending, but still, he was anxious since his secret was in her keeping. And the more now that she had tried her hand with his wife and failed. For he saw that vanity had kept her mouth shut if she had won over her mistress to better ways, and her love for her would have grown by getting her own way with her. But now she had failed, she bore her mistress a grudge for not being won over, or at the best, was become indifferent to the business so that she might very readily blab. For the moment, all Mr. Tebrick could do was to keep her from going into Stockholm to the village, where she would meet all her old cronies, where there would be certain to be any number of inquiries about what was going on at Rylands and so on. But as he saw, that it was clearly beyond his power, however vigilant he might be, to watch over the old woman and his wife, and to prevent anyone from meeting with either of them, he began to consider what he best do, since he had sent away his servants and the gardener, giving out a story of having received bad news and his wife going away to London where he would join her. They're probably going out of England and so on. He knew well enough that there would be a great talk in the neighbourhood. And as he now stayed on, contrary to what he had said, there would be further rumour. Indeed, had he known it, there was a story already going round the country that his wife had run away with Major Solmes, that he was gone mad with grief, that he had shot his dogs and his horses and shut himself alone. The house would speak to no one. The story was made up by his neighbours, not because they were fanciful or wanted to deceive, but like most tittle-tattle to fill a gap, as few like to confess ignorance. And if people are asked about such or such a man, they must have something to say, or they suffer in everybody's opinion, are set down as dull or out of the swim. In this way I met not long ago, with someone who, after talking some while and not knowing me or who I was, told me that David Garnett was dead and died of being bitten by a cat after he had tormented it. He had long grown a nuisance to his friends, as an exorbitant sponge upon them, and the world was well rid of him. Hearing the story of myself diverted me at the time, but I fully believe it has served me in good stead since, for it set me on my guard as perhaps nothing else would have done, against accepting for true all floating rumour and village gossip, so that now I am second nature a true skeptic, and scarcely believe anything unless the evidence for it is conclusive. Indeed, I could never have got to the bottom of this history if I had believed 1/10 part of what I was told. There was so much of it that was either manifestly false and absurd, or else contradictory to the ascertained facts, It is therefore only the bare bones of the story which you will find written here, for I have rejected all the flowery embroideries which would be entertaining reading enough, I dare say, for some. But if there be any doubt of the truth of a thing, it is poor sort of entertainment to read about, in my opinion. To get back to our story, Mr. Tebrick, having considered how much the appetite of his neighbours would be whetted to find out the mystery by his remaining in that part of the country, determined that the best thing he could do was to remove. After some time turning the thing over in his mind, he decided that no place would be so good for his purpose as old Nanny's cottage. It was 30 miles away from Stockholm, which in the country means as far as Timbuktu does to us in London. Then it was near Tangley, and his lady, having known it from her childhood, would feel at home there. And also it was utterly remote, there being no village near it, or manor house other than Tagley Hall, which was now untenanted for the greater part of the year. Nor did it mean imparting a secret to others, for there was only Mrs. Cork's son, a widower, who being out at work all day would be easily outwitted, the more so as he was stone deaf and of a slow and saturnine disposition. To be sure, there was little Polly, Mrs. Cork's granddaughter, but either Mr. Tebrick forgot her altogether, or else reckoned her as a mere baby, and not to be thought of as a danger. He talked the thing over with Mrs. Cork, and they decided upon it out of hand. The truth is, the old woman was beginning to regret that her love and her curiosity had ever brought her back to Rylands, since so far she had got much work and little credit by it. When it was settled, Mr. Tebrick disposed of the remaining business he had at Rylands in the afternoon, and that was chiefly putting out his wife's riding horse into the keeping of a farmer nearby, for he thought he would drive over with his own horse, and the other spare horse tandem in the dog cart. The next morning, they locked up the house and they departed, having first secured Mrs. Tebrick in a large wicker hamper where she would be tolerably comfortable. This was for safety, for in agitation of driving she might jump out, and on the other hand, if a dog scented her and she were loose, she might be in danger of her life. Mr. Tebrick drove with the hamper beside him on the front seat, and spoke to her gently, very often. She was overcome by the excitement of the journey, and kept poking her nose first through one crevice, then through another, turning, twisting the whole time, and peeping out to see what they were passing. It was a bitterly cold day, and when they had gone about 15 miles, they drew up by the roadside to rest the horses, have their own luncheon, for he dared not stop at an inn. He knew that any living creature in a hamper, even if it be only an old fowl, always draws attention. There'd be several loafers, most likely, who would notice that he had a fox with him. And even if he left the hamper in a cart, the dogs at the inn would be sure to sniff out her scent. So, not to take any chances, he drew up at the side of the road and rested there, though it was freezing hard and a northeast wind howling. He took his precious hamper down, unharnessed his 2 horses, covered them with rugs and gave them their corn. Then he opened the basket, let his wife out. She was quite beside herself with joy, running hither, thither, bouncing up on him, looking about her and even rolling over on the ground. Mr. Tebrick took this to mean she was glad at making this journey, and rejoiced equally with her. As for Mrs. Cork, she sat motionless on the back seat of the dog cart, well wrapped up, eating her sandwiches, but would not speak a word. When they had stayed there half an hour, Mr. Tebrick harnessed the horses again. Though he was so cold, he could scarcely buckle the straps, put his vixen in her basket, but seeing that she wanted to look about her, he let her tear away the osiers with her teeth, till she had made a hole big enough for her to put her head out of. They drove on again, and the snow began to come down, and that in earnest, so that he began to be afraid they would never cover the ground. But just after the nightfall they got in, and he was content to leave unharnessing the horses and baiting them to Simon, Mrs. Cork's son. His vixen was tired by then, as well as he, and they slept together, he in the bed and she under it, very contently. The next morning he looked about him at the place and found the thing there that he most wanted, and that was a little walled-in garden where his wife could run in freedom and yet be in safety. After they had had breakfast, she was wild to go out into the snow, so they went out together, and he had never seen such a mad creature in all his life as his wife was then, for she ran to and fro as if she were crazy, biting at the snow, rolling in it, and round in circles, and rushed back at him fiercely, as if she meant to bite him. He joined her in the frolic, and began snowballing her till she was so wild that it was all he could do to quiet her again and bring her indoors for luncheon. Indeed, with her gambolings, she tracked the whole garden over with her feet. He could see where she had rolled in the snow, where she had danced in it. And looking at those prints of her feet as they went in, made his heart ache. He knew not why. They passed the first day at the old nanny's cottage happily enough, without their usual bickerings. And this because of the novelty of the snow which had diverted them. In the afternoon he first showed his wife to little Polly, who eyed her very curiously, but hung back shyly, and seemed a good deal afraid of the fox. But Mr. Tebrick took upon a book, let them get acquainted by themselves, and presently saw that, looking up, that they'd come together, and Polly was stroking his wife, patting her, running her fingers through her fur. Presently, she began talking to the fox, and then brought her doll in to show her, so that very soon they were very good playmates together. Watching the two gave Mr. Tebrick great delight, and in particular, he noticed that there was something very motherly in his vixen. She was indeed far above the child in intelligence, and restrained herself from too hasty an action, but while she seemed to wait on Polly's pleasure, yet she managed to give a twist to the game, whatever it was, that never failed to delight the little girl. In short, in a very little while, Polly was so taken with her new playmate that she cried when she was parted from her and wanted her always with her. This disposition of Mrs. Tebrick's made Mrs. Cork more agreeable than she had been lately either to husband or the wife. Three days after they had come to the cottage, the weather had changed, and they woke up one morning to find the snow gone, the wind in the south, and the sun shining, so that it was like the first beginning of spring. Mr. Tebrick let his vixen out into the garden after breakfast, stayed with her a while, then went indoors, to write some letters. When he got out again, he could see no sign of her anywhere, so that he ran about bewildered, calling to her. At last, he spied a mound of fresh earth by the wall in one corner of the garden, and running thither found there was a hole freshly dug, seeming to go under the wall. On this, he ran out of the garden quickly till he had come to the other side of the wall, but there was no hole there, so he concluded that she had not yet got through. So it proved to be, for reaching down into the hole, he felt her brush with his hand and could hear her distinctly working away with her claws. He called to her then, saying,
Sylvia, Sylvia, why do you do this? Are you trying to escape from me? I am your husband, and if I keep you confined, it is to protect you, not to let you run into danger. Show me how I can make you happy, and I will do it. But do not try to escape from me. I love you, Sylvia. Is it because of that you want to fly from me, to go into the world where you will be in danger of your life always? There are dogs everywhere, and they all would kill you if it were not for me. Come out, Sylvia. Come out.
But Sylvia would not listen to him, so he waited there, silent. Then he spoke to her in a different way, asking her had she forgot the bargain she made with him, that she would not go out alone, but not when she had all the liberty of a garden to herself. Would she wantonly break her word? And he asked her were they not married, and had she not always found him a good husband to her? But she heeded this neither until presently, his temper getting somewhat out of hand, he cursed her obstinacy, told her if she would be a damned fox, she was welcome to it. For his part, he could get his own way. She had not escaped yet. He would dig her out, for he still had time, and if she struggled, put her in a bag. These words brought her forth instantly, and she looked at him with as much astonishment as if she knew not what could have made him angry. Yes, she fawned on him, but in a good-natured kind of way, as if she were a very good wife, putting up wonderfully with her husband's temper. These airs of hers made the poor gentleman, so simple was he, repent his outburst and feel most ashamed. But, for all that, when she was out of the hole, he filled it up with great stones and beat them in with a crowbar, so she should find her work at that point harder than before she was tempted to begin again. In the afternoon, he let her go again into the garden, but sent little Polly with her to keep her company. But presently, on looking out, he saw his vixen had climbed up into the limbs of an old pear tree, and was looking over the wall, and was not so far from it, but she might jump over it if she could get a little further. Mr. Tebrick ran out into the garden as quick as he could, and when his wife saw him, it seemed she was startled, and made a false spring at the wall, so that she missed reaching it, and fell back heavily to the ground, and lay there insensible. When Mr. Tebrick got up to her, he found her head was twisted under her by her fall, and the neck seemed to be broken. The shock was so great to him that for some time he could not do anything, but knelt beside her, turning her limp body stupidly in his hands. At length, he recognized that she was indeed dead, and was beginning to consider what dreadful afflictions God had visited him with. he blasphemed horribly and called on God to strike him dead or give his wife back to him.
Is it not enough?
He cried, adding a foul, blasphemous oath.
You should rob me of my dear wife, making her a fox. But now, you must rob me of that fox too, that has been my only solace and comfort in this affliction.
Then he burst into tears and began wringing his hands and continued there in such an extremity of grief for half an hour that he cared nothing, neither what he was doing nor what would become of him in the future, but only knew that his life was ended now. He would not live any longer than he could help. All this while, the girl Polly stood by, first staring, then asking him what had happened, and lastly crying with fear. But he never heeded her, nor looked at her, but only tore his hair, sometimes shouted at God or shook his fist at heaven. So in a fright, Polly opened the door and ran out into the garden. At length, worn out, and as it were all numb with his loss, Mr. Tebrick got up and went within doors, leaving his dear fox lying near where she had fallen. He stayed indoors only 2 minutes, and came out again with a razor in his hand, intending to cut his own throat, for he was out of his senses in this first paroxysm of grief. But his vixen was gone, at which he looked about for a moment bewildered, and then enraged, thinking that somebody must have taken the body. The door of the garden being open, he ran straight through it. Now this door, which had been left ajar by Polly when she ran off, opened into a little courtyard where the fowls were shut in at night. The woodhouse and the privy also stood there. On the far side of it, from the garden gate, were 2 wooden doors big enough, when opened, to let a cart enter, and high enough to keep a man from looking over into the yard. When Mr. Tebrick got into the yard, he found his vixen leaping up at these doors, and wild with terror, but as lively as ever he saw her in his life. He ran up to her, but she shrank away from him, and would then have dodged him too, but he caught hold of her. She bared her teeth at him, but he paid no heed to that, only picked her straight up into his arms and took her indoors. Yet all the while he could scarce believe his eyes to see her living, and felt her all over, very carefully, to find if she had not some bones broken. But no, he could find none. Indeed, it was some hours before this silly gentleman began to suspect the truth, which was that his vixen had practiced a deception upon him, and all the time he was bemoaning his loss in such heart-rending terms, she was only shamming death to run away directly when she was able. If it had not been that the yard gates were shut, which was a mere chance, she had got her liberty by that trick, and that this was only a trick of hers to sham dead was plain when he had thought it over. Indeed, it is an old and time-honored trick of the fox. It is an Aesop's, and 100 other writers have confirmed it since. But so thoroughly had he been deceived by her that at first he was as much overcome with joy at his wife still being alive as he had been with grief a little while before, thinking her dead. He took her in his arms, hugging her to him, thanking God 12 times for her preservation. But his kissing her and fondling her had very little effect now, for she did not answer him by licking or soft looks, but stayed huddled up and sullen, with her hair bristling on her neck, her ears laid back every time he touched her. At first, he thought this might be because he had touched some broken bone or tender place where she had been hurt. But at last, the truth came to him. Thus, he was again to suffer, and though knowing the pain of her treachery to him was nothing to the grief of losing her, yet it was more insidious and lasting. At first, from a mere nothing, this pain grew gradually until it was a torture to him. If he had been one of your stock ordinary husbands, such as one who, by experience, had learned never to inquire too closely into his wife's doings, her comings and goings, never to ask her how she spent the day, for fear he should be made the more of a fool, had Mr. Tebrick been such a one, he had been luckier, and his pain would have been almost nothing. But you must consider that he had never been deceived once by his wife in the course of their married life. No. She had never told him as much as one white lie, but had always been frank, open, and ingenuous, as if she and her husband were not husband and wife, or indeed of opposite sexes, yet we must rate him as very foolish, and thus living thus with a fox, which beast has the same reputation for deceitfulness, craft, and cunning in all countries, all ages, and amongst all races of mankind. He should expect this fox to be as candid and honest with him in all things as the country girl he had married. His wife's sullenness and bad temper continued that day, for she cowered away from him, hid under the sofa, nor could he persuade her to come out from there. Even when it was her dinner time she stayed, refusing resolutely to be tempted out with food, lying so quiet that he heard nothing from her for hours. At night, he carried her up to the bedroom, but she was still sullen and refused to eat a morsel, though she drank a little water during the night when she fancied he was asleep. The next morning was the same, and by now Mr. Tebrick had been through all the agonies of wounded self-esteem, disillusionment, and despair that a man can suffer. But though his emotions rose up in his heart, nearly stifled him, he showed no sign of them to her, neither did he abate one jot his tenderness and consideration for his vixen. At breakfast, he tempted her with a freshly killed young pullet. It hurt him to make this advance for her, for hitherto he had kept her strictly on cooked meats. But the pain of seeing her refuse was harder still for him to bear. Added to this was now an anxiety, lest she should starve herself to death rather than stay with him any longer. All that morning he kept her close, but in the afternoon he let her loose again in the garden after he had lopped the pear tree, so that she could not repeat her performance of climbing. But seeing how disgustedly she looked while he was away, never offering to run or to play as she was used, but only standing stock still with her tail between her legs, her ears flattened, and the hair bristling on her shoulders. Seeing this, he left her to herself out of mere humanity. When he came out, after half an hour, he found that she was gone, but there was a fair-sized hole by the wall, and she just buried all but her brush, digging desperately to get under the wall and make her escape. He ran up to the hole, put his arm in after her, called to her to come out, but she would not. So at first he began pulling her out by the shoulder, then his hold slipping by the hind legs. As soon As he had drawn her forth, she whipped round, snapped at his hand, and bit it through near the joint of the thumb, but let it go instantly. They stayed there for a minute facing each other, he on his knees, and she facing him, the picture of unrepentant wickedness and fury. Being thus on his knees, Mr. Tebrick was down on her level very nearly. Her muzzle was thrust almost into his face. Her ears lay flat on her head, her gums were bared in a silent snarl, and all her beautiful teeth were threatening him, that she would bite him again. Her back, too, was half-arched, all her hair bristling, her brush held drooping. But it was her eyes that held his, with her slit pupils looking at him with savage desperation and rage. The blood ran very freely from his hand, but he never noticed that, or the pain of it either, for all his thoughts were for his wife.
"What is this, Sylvia?"
he said very quietly.
"What is this? Why are you so savage now? If I stand between you and your freedom, it is because I love you. Is it such torment to be with me?"
But Sylvia never stirred a muscle.
"You would not do this if you were not in anguish, poor beast. You want your freedom. I cannot keep you. I cannot hold you to vows made when you were a woman. Why? You've forgotten who I am."
The tears then began running down his cheeks. He sobbed and said to her,
"Go. I shall not keep you. Poor beast. Poor beast. I love you. I love you. Go if you want to. But if you remember me, come back. I shall never keep you against your will. Go. Go. But kiss me now."
He leant forward then, put his lips to her snarling fangs, but though she kept snarling, she did not bite him. Then he got up quickly and went to the door of the garden that opened into a little paddock against a wood. When he opened it, she went through it like an arrow, crossed the paddock like a puff of smoke, and in a moment was gone from his sight. Then, suddenly finding himself alone, Mr. Tebrick came, as it were, to himself, and ran after her, calling her by name, shouting to her, and so went plunging into the wood, and through it for almost a mile, for about a mile, running almost blindly. At last, when he was worn out, he sat down, seeing that she had gone beyond recovery, and it was already night. As he went, he bound up his hand that was still running with blood. His coat was torn, his hat lost, and his face scratched right across with briars. Now, in cold blood, he began to reflect on what he had done, and to repent bitterly, having set his wife free. He had betrayed her, so that now from his act she must lead the life of a wild fox forever, must undergo all the rigors and hardships of the climate, and all the hazards of a hunted creature. When Mr. Tebrick got back to the cottage, he found Mrs. Cork was up, sitting up for him. It was already late.
"What have you done with Mrs. Tebrick, sir?
I missed her, and I missed you, and I have not known what to do, expecting something dreadful had happened. I've been sitting up for you half the night. And where is she now, sir?" She accosted him vigorously, but Mr. Tebrick stood silent. At length he said,
"I have let her go. She has run away."
"Poor Miss Sylvia!" cried the old woman. "Poor creature! You ought to be ashamed, sir. Let her go indeed. Poor lady, is that the way for her husband to talk? It is a disgrace, but I saw it coming from the first." The old woman was white with fury. She did not mind what she said, but Mr. Tebrick was not listening to her. At last, he looked at her and saw that she had just begun to cry. So, he went out of the room and up to bed and lay down as he was in his clothes, utterly exhausted, and fell into a dog's sleep, starting up every now and then with horror, falling back with fatigue. It was late when he woke up, but cold and raw, and he felt cramped in all his limbs. As he lay, he heard again the noise which had woken him. The trotting of several horses and the voices of men riding by the house. Mr. Tebrick jumped up and ran to the window and then looked out. The first thing he saw was a gentleman in a pink coat riding at a walk down the lane. At the sight, Mr. Tebrick waited no longer, but pulling on his boots in mad haste ran out instantly, meaning to say they must not hunt, and how his wife was escaped and they might kill her. But when he found himself outside the cottage, words failed him, and fury took possession of him. So that he could only cry out,
"How dare you, you damned blackguard!"
And so with a stick in his hand, he threw himself on the gentleman in the pink coat, seized his horse's rein, and catching the gentleman by the leg was trying to throw him. But really it is impossible to say what Mr. Tebrick intended by his behaviour, or what he would have done, for the gentleman, finding himself suddenly assaulted in so unexpected a fashion, by so strange a tousled and dishevelled figure, clubbed his hunting crop and dealt him a blow on the temple so that he fell insensible. Another gentleman rode up at this moment, and they were civil enough to dismount and carry Mr. Tebrick into the cottage, where they were met by old Nanny, who kept wringing her hands and told them that Mr. Tebrick's wife had run away, that she was a vixen, that was the cause that Mr. Tebrick had run out and assaulted them. The two gentlemen could not help laughing at this, and mounting their horses, rode on without delay, after telling each other that Mr. Tebrick, whoever he was certainly a madman, and the old woman seemed as mad as her master. The story, however, went the rounds of the gentry in those parts, and perfectly confirmed everyone in the previous opinion, namely that Mr. Tebrick was mad, and his wife had run away from him. The part about her being a vixen was laughed at by the few that heard it, but was soon left out as immaterial to the story, and incredible in itself, though afterwards it came to be remembered, and its significance to be understood. When Mr. Tebrick came to himself, it was past noon, and his head was aching so painfully that he could only call to mind, in a confused way, what had happened. However, he sent off Mrs. Cork's son directly on one of his horses to inquire about the hunt. At the same time, he gave orders to old Nanny that she was to put out food and water for her mistress, on the chance that she might yet be in the neighbourhood. By nightfall, Simon was back with the news that the hunt had had a very long run but had lost one fox, and during a covert had chopped an old dog fox and so ended the day's sport. This put poor Mr. Tebrick in some hopes again. He rose at once from his bed and went out into the wood and began calling his wife, but was overcome with faintness and lay down and so passed the night in the open from mere weakness. In the morning, he got back to the cottage, but he had taken a chill, so he had to keep his bed for 3 or 4 days after. All this time, he had put food out for every night, but though rats came and ate all of it, there were never any prints of a fox. At last, his anxiety began working another way, that is, he came to think it possible that his vixen would have gone back to stalk her, so he had his horses harnessed in the dog cart and brought to the door and then drove over to Rylands, though he was still in a fever and with a heavy cold upon him. After that, he lived always solitary, keeping away from his fellows, and only seeing one man, called Askew, who had been brought up a jockey at Wantage, but was grown too big for his profession. He mounted this loafing fellow on one of his horses 3 days a week, had him follow the hunt, report to him whenever they killed, and if he could view the fox, so much the better, then bade him describe it minutely so he should know if it were his Sylvia. But he dared not trust himself to go himself, lest his passion should master him, and he might commit a murder. Every time there was a hunt in the neighborhood, he set the gates wide open at Rylands, and the house doors open, and taking his gun stood sentinel in hope that his wife would run in, as she were pressed by the hounds, so that he could save her. But only once a hunt came near, and when 2 foxhounds that had lost the main pack strayed onto his land, and he shot them instantly and buried him afterwards himself. It was not long now to the end of the season, as it was the middle of March, but living, as he did at this time, Mr. Tebrick grew more and more to be a true misanthrope. He denied admittance to any that came to visit him, and rarely showed himself to his fellows, but went out chiefly in the early mornings before people were out, in the hopes of seeing his beloved fox. Indeed, it was only this hope that he would see her again that kept him alive, for he had become so careless of his own comfort in every way that he very seldom ate a proper meal, taking no more than a crust of bread with a morsel of cheese in the whole day, though sometimes he would drink half a bottle of whiskey to drown his sorrow and to get off to sleep. For sleep fled from him, and no sooner did he begin dozing, but he awoke with a start, thinking he had heard something. He let his beard grow too, and though he had always been very particular in his person before, he now was utterly careless at it. Gave up washing himself for a week or 2 at a stretch, and if there was dirt under his fingernails, let it stop there. All this disorder fed a malignant pleasure in him, for by now he had come to hate his fellow men, was embittered against all human decencies and decorum. For strange to tell, he never once in these months regretted his dear wife, whom he had so much loved. No, all that time he grieved for now was his departed vixen. He was haunted all this time, not by the memory of a sweet and gentle woman, but by the recollection of an animal, a beast, it is true, that could sit at a table, play piquet when it could, but for all that nothing really but a wild beast. His one hope now was the recovery of this beast, and of this he dreamed continually. Likewise, both waking and sleeping, he was visited by visions of her. Her mask, her full white tagged brush, white throat, the thick fur, and her ears all haunted him. Every one of her foxy ways was now so absolutely precious to him that I believed that he had known, if he had known for certain she was dead, and had thoughts of marrying a second time, he would never have been happy with a woman. No, indeed. He would have been more tempted to get himself a tame fox, and would have counted that as good a marriage as he could make. Yet, all this proceeded, one may say, from a passion and a true conjugal fidelity that it would be hard to find matched in this world. Though we may think him a fool, almost a madman, we must, when we look closer, find much to respect in his extraordinary devotion. How different indeed was he from those who, if their wives go mad, shut them in mad houses and give themselves up to concubinage, and nay, what is more, there are many who extenuate such conduct too. But Mr. Tebrick was of a very different temper, and though his wife was now nothing but a hunted beast, cared for no one in the world but her. We'll tie it up here.